Back in 1968, something incredible happened in Czechoslovakia. It was a wave of hope and reform that we now call the Prague Spring. But, this wasn't something that just appeared out of nowhere. It was the result of deep, deep cracks that have been forming for over 2 decades. So in this explainer, we're going to peel back the layers and see exactly what caused this amazing brief thaw in the Cold War.
I mean, how does a country that's under the thumb of the Soviet Union suddenly start talking about freedom? What pushes an entire society right to its breaking point? That's the big question, right? And the answer, as we'll see, is this toxic mix of a collapsing economy, brutal political repression, and a huge power shift at the very top.
Okay, so to really get what was going on, you've got to look at the picture they were trying to paint for the rest of the world. Officially, Czechoslovakia was supposed to be a success story, the star pupil of the Soviet bloc. But underneath that shiny surface, well, the reality was something else entirely.
And wow, this really lays it all out, doesn't it? On one hand, you've got the official story. Czechoslovakia, the model satellite, doing great, totally obedient. But peel back the curtain, and the reality for people living there? Ever since a Soviet-backed coup way back in 1948, they'd been living under complete domination. Moscow had the final say on everything. And that kind of tension, between what they said was true and what people were actually living, well, that couldn't last forever. And that tension, it started to show up big time in the first major crack, the economy. You have to understand, the whole system wasn't set up to help the people of Czechoslovakia. It was basically a machine built to feed the Soviet Union, and by the 1960s, that machine was seriously starting to fall apart.
So let's get into the nitty-gritty. The country's entire industry was basically forced to just churn out steel and raw materials that got shipped off to the Soviet Union. And what does that mean for the average person? Well, it meant there was hardly anything left to make stuff people actually wanted to buy. Consumer goods were super scarce. Things got so bad that the country's national income actually went down between 1962 and 63. They even tried a half-hearted reform in 65, but it was too little, too late. The system was just fundamentally broken.
Okay, if you want one number that just perfectly sums up how broken this whole thing was, look at this. There was a locomotive factory, and the official Communist Party plan, the plan from the top, demanded they produce 400 locomotives a year. So how many did they actually make? 70. 70! That's not just missing a target, that's a total spectacular failure that everybody could see with their own two eyes.
And that's not just a number on a page, right? This is about real people's lives. This quote from a worker in that very factory just hits you right in the gut. We were robbed of our output, our wages. It wasn't just inefficiency. It was a deep, personal feeling of being used, of being robbed by a system that was working for someone else. That's powerful stuff.
So you've got this economic misery, right? But it gets worse, because that went hand in hand with an absolute suffocating lack of freedom. Everyday life in Czechoslovakia was lived under the constant, heavy grip of the state.
The government's playbook for keeping people in line was just brutal. The country was basically run by the secret police. If you dared to have a different opinion, you were crushed. There was absolutely no freedom of speech. The government censored everything: radio, newspapers, TV. And then there were the political purges in the early 50s. Thousands of people, anyone who was even suspected of being an enemy, were targeted, all on Stalin's orders.
But here's the thing about pressure. You can only keep the lid on for so long. And by 1966, you start to see the first real public cracks. Students start demonstrating. And this was a huge deal. It was the first clear sign that the government's control was slipping, that the younger generation just wasn't going to stay silent anymore. The fear was beginning to break.
So all this bubbling anger and frustration needed a spark, right? A catalyst to set things in motion. And that spark came from a political showdown at the very, very top. And it all centered on this one deeply unpopular leader, Antonin Novotny.
Antonin Novotny. This guy was basically the walking, talking symbol of everything people couldn't stand. He was an old-school, hardline communist who refused to even think about reform. He just slavishly followed whatever Moscow said. He was seen as corrupt, and he was hated for holding the country back.
And then things started moving fast, like really fast. The '66 student protests showed everyone just how unpopular Novotny was. By late '67, reformers inside the party, guys like Alexander Dubček, openly challenged him. But the real knockout blow came in December. The Soviet leader, Brezhnev, shows up in Prague, sees for himself how much everyone hates Novotny, and basically just pulls his support. And without Moscow's blessing, Novotny was toast. Game over. By January '68, he was out.
So the old guard is out, the hardliner is gone, and that creates a power vacuum, an opening for something totally new. And into that opening steps Alexander Dubček, who comes in with this radical new idea that just grabs the imagination of the whole country.
Now, you might think the new guy would be some radical outsider, but Dubček wasn't that at all. He was a lifelong communist, a decorated war hero from the resistance against the Nazis. He was a party man through and through, but he had also started to believe in more liberal economic ideas. He was seen as a reformer. But, and this is so important, Moscow actually gave him the green light at first. They thought he was a safe choice who could make communism a little more popular.
So, what was his big idea? It was something he called socialism with a human face. The goal wasn't to tear down communism, no. The idea was to change it from the inside out, to get rid of the secret police and the censorship, to fix the broken economy, and to let people, actually have some cultural freedom. For the Eastern Bloc, this was totally revolutionary.
So there you have it, the perfect storm, right? A broken economy, a repressed population, and a political power struggle, all coming together to throw out the old guard and open the door for something brand new. The Prague Spring had officially begun. But it leaves us with this massive hanging question. Could this beautiful, fragile experiment in freedom, could socialism with a human face ever really survive right in the shadow of the superpower that had controlled it for 20 years?